Greenhouse gas removal is a really, really important thread of what we call climate repair. So climate repair, just to remind people, involves emissions reduction and then realising that emissions reduction isn't going that well. The last time I looked is that how well are we actually doing on emissions reduction? We are increasing the rate at which we are emitting greenhouse gases every year. I don't think that means reduction, but we've got to go and do it. But therefore, let's worry about the fact that we're working a bit too slowly in that regard, and therefore the next pillar is greenhouse gas removal, because we will need to get to a level, according to James Hansen, of about 350 parts per million of greenhouse gases if we want to have something that looks sustainable. And we're already at 420 parts per million when it comes to carbon dioxide. You throw in methane, depending on your timescales of interest, then it's something like 500 parts per million. That's some way above the Hansen target of 350, and therefore we are going to need to look at what we can do to remove greenhouse gases from the environment. And that's the topic of today, and we're going to start with we're going to have Aliki, who's going to talk to us about actually the second greenhouse gas, which is methane, and then we will go back to the bigger one in terms of just the contribution to warming right at the moment, which is carbon dioxide. Will be followed by Professor John Taylor and then Jago Strong-Wright, PhD student. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean. So, I am Aliki. I am a research associate at the Department of Engineering and also working with the Center for Climate Repair. My research falls into the broader context of addressing greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating climate change. And more specifically, I'm focusing on atmospheric methane removal, and my project aims to accelerate the rate of methane oxidation to achieve that. As you can see in the figure here, methane concentration in the atmosphere in parts per billion is on the rise also the last decades, but shows a significant decrease from 2010 onwards. So we need to find effective ways to tackle this powerful greenhouse gas before it causes further harm in our planet. However, although methane is 200 times more dilute than carbon dioxide, its concentration in the atmosphere is 2 parts per million, while the concentration of carbon dioxide is 400 parts per million. It is 85 times more potent over short time scales of 20 years. So everyone discusses that carbon dioxide has a harmful impact in the planet, which is true, but methane is responsible for about a third of global warming. That's why we need to find technologies to achieve atmospheric methane reduction and removal, and in order to combat climate change and promote environmental sustainability. The main goal of my work, as mentioned previously, is to accelerate the rate of methane oxidation, and we are doing this by developing catalytic methods like photocatalysis and using photocatalysis and electrocatalysis. Methane emissions arise from various natural and human activities. A significant fraction of 39% comes from natural sources, for example, wetlands, while 26% comes from agriculture and 23% from oil and gas industry. Finally, 12% comes from waste. So, what we are interested in our project is to develop applications where the methane conversion can act as a co-benefit. And what I mean from that is we are trying to develop materials that can reduce, for example, can be placed in coatings or windows or ventilation, in filters in ventilation systems. And more specifically, we are trying to develop materials that can reduce maintenance bills and cleaning bills because they will have self-cleaning properties, and at the same time will help the conversion of methane. So the conversion of methane will act as a co-benefit. An alternative application, as mentioned before, is to place those materials, catalytic materials basically, on filters in ventilation systems. And given the fact that someone pays for the air to move through those buildings and filters, at the same time we can achieve the methane conversion as a co-benefit. So the two important factors that we have to consider is cost effectiveness and scalability. Therefore, we are looking for materials that are cheap and scalable and also well established in industry. So titanium dioxide, either on its own or in a combination with some metal particles, can be a choice like that because it is cheap, it is well established in industry, and also it is safe as it is in the products that we are using in our everyday life, like our toothpaste, sun creams, etc. So just to point out and sum up our goals here. First of all is the examination of photocatalysts for atmospheric methane removal, and select those ones that can be viable for deployment. We are trying to use conditions that can be as realistic as possible, so low methane concentrations down to atmospheric levels of 2 ppm, use of UV and visible light, atmospheric temperature, and consideration of relevant background species like water and nitrogen oxides. I have to mention here that existing work on methane catalysis is basically on unrealistic conditions and high concentrations. Most of the studies use more than 1,000 ppm and some others 10,000 ppm of methane for all the types of catalysis, while also high temperatures and expensive catalysts are used. So what we firstly did in order to identify and refine photocatalysts that can operate effectively in realistic conditions is that we did an extended literature review in order to find the optimal catalytic materials for a photocatalysis experiment for the removal of methane. We concluded that palladium, silver, and nickel on 3 different supports, titanium dioxide anatase, titanium dioxide rutile, and zinc oxide respectively, could be very good choices, and we synthesized that at 5% catalyst loading that you can see here on the box. The choice of these substrates was based on their absorption edge wavelength, which is suitable for UV light that we are using in the photocatalysis experiment. So apart from those metal oxides combinations, we also tested just the substrates, the different phases of crystalline phases of titanium dioxide and zinc oxide to see their impact. So the first step of our process is to do the catalyst synthesis, and the method that we are using is the wet impregration method. This is a method for depositing metal onto a porous support and consists of 3 main steps. The first one is the preparation of the metal precursor solution, where it is dissolved in water in order to create a solution, and then we add the metal oxide powder. Then this impregnated powder is dried in an oven at 60 degrees C for 24 hours to remove the moisture. And finally, we heat the dried catalyst at 500 degrees C for 12 hours in order to improve its metals dispersion and also stabilize the catalyst. So these synthesized catalysts are placed here in this is our photoreactor, and at the bottom of the cylinder we have our catalyst reactor where our synthesized catalysts are placed. On the top we have placed the UV light in order to enable the catalyst to absorb effectively the light. The inlet comes from our flow system consisting of methane, oxygen, and nitrogen, while the outlet is connected to the gas chromatograph, from where we can evaluate the methane oxidation. We are also using a variac, which is that one, in order to modulate the intensity. So the key equipment, apart from our photoreactor, is our gas chromatograph. And this is the outcome, the detector's response over time. Let's say the GC, the gas chromatograph, gives us data of how much methane has been converted to carbon dioxide by measuring the area of the peaks that we get from methane and carbon dioxide. So we tested 4 different methane concentrations at 50 ppm, 10 ppm, 5 ppm, and 2 ppm, which is the level of concentration of methane in the atmosphere, and also at 3 different light intensities, at 59, 32, and 4 watt per meter square. So here in this slide, I will show you a comparison of the different catalysts for the 3 different light intensities that I just mentioned at 50 ppm methane concentration, let's say at the highest one that we tested. So what we can see here is that the material 5% palladium on titanium dioxide anatase shows a conversion of around, at the higher light intensity, shows a conversion of around 46%. And also 5% palladium on titanium rutile and silver on titanium dioxide anatase seem to have a very good performance. So at 50 ppm, we can say that when the metal is combined with the substrate, like titanium dioxide in this case, it acts as a catalytic promoter. Therefore, it promotes electron transfer and allows methane to absorb on the surface effectively. So the use of metals like palladium, silver, or even nickel can overcome mass transport limitations at high concentrations. While we can see that without the consideration of the metals for the 4 last materials, which is titanium anatase in all the phases and zinc oxide, the metal oxides here become saturated with methane and their performance drop. So in the next slide, I will show you exactly a similar experiment, but here I am using an initial concentration of 10 ppm instead of 50 ppm for methane concentration. So at 10 ppm, the substrates without the use of any metal, especially zinc oxide and titanium dioxide, after medium power are strongly activated. We can get like almost 50% methane conversion for titanium anatase. So we don't need any additional help from metals at lower concentrations because probably we don't have so much saturation issues, and titanium dioxide and zinc oxide can effectively handle the oxidation processes on their own. So given the fact that titanium anatase has a very good performance at 10 ppm, we also tried to test it at even lower concentrations, so 5 ppm and 2 ppm, and see its effect. So from this chart, we can see that the lower the methane concentration, the higher the methane conversion, and this is probably to the diffusion, that the diffusion to the surface happens more easily at lower concentrations. So for the highest light intensity that we have here at 59 watt per meter square, 76% of methane conversion can be achieved at 2 ppm. So this material, titanium dioxide, which is, we know it is cheap and widely available, seems a very good potential integration into ventilation systems. And also the phase that we are using here, anatase, which is less expensive than the other ones, rutile or mixing anatase with rutile, has a higher band gap compared to the rutile phase. And this shows that it's more efficient for photocatalysis in UV light. So to conclude, our next steps is to consider nitrogen oxides in our system along with methane in order to emulate real-world conditions as much as possible, and also develop and test titanium dioxide-coated filter prototypes that can be applied in ventilation systems. And we are going to use a UVC light to do that as we are doing at the moment, because it also has the advantage of effectively inactivate viruses. So we ensure also the air quality thing. So, and the last thing is that we will test the visible light for selected material in order to see their impact under this condition. So thank you very much.
So I was going to suggest that we did questions at the end all together, so we'll have a panel if that's okay. So Aliki, thank you very much. We're going to be followed up by Professor John Taylor.
Thanks very much, John and Aliki, and thanks all for coming. It's wonderful to see so many faces here. So I'm going to tell, oh, this is the wrong one. We're going to go in reverse order here. Okay, I'm going to tell you about some of our work trying to remove carbon from the atmosphere, investigating ways to do this. And we're focusing here on the ocean and the ocean's potential role in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Just to say, this is my email address. I'm very happy to take any questions. If you're interested in this, please feel free to contact me. So before we talk about the ocean's role, let's take a step back and kind of go to what Sean talked about and ask the question, why do we need to remove greenhouse gases at all? So what I'm showing here is a slide from a figure from the latest IPCC report. This is a scenario that allows us to meet our climate targets. It's kind of a cartoon here. The line you're seeing on the vertical axis is the net greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. So when that line is positive, when you're above the horizontal line, the net zero line, there's an emission, a net emission to the atmosphere. When the line is negative, you can look at the thick black line there. When it's negative, then there's a net removal of greenhouse gases. Okay, the dashed line is CO2, and the solid line is the total. So you can see what Aliki talked about, the contribution of methane and other gases that make up the rest. Sort of that 2/3, 1/3 if you look over on the left. Okay, so now if you look at the orange boxes, these are the removals. So right now, essentially all of the removal we're doing is coming from land use changes. So you can think reforestation, planting back rainforests and the like. But we think that that's not able to scale enough to meet our targets. And essentially to meet a target, to have a scenario like this where we meet our climate targets, we have to do two things. We have to have deep and rapid emissions reductions. So that's the emissions curves, the blue curves falling down quickly. We clearly have to do that. But we also need to remove greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere and that will become, will add to the atmosphere in the coming years. And that's the orange. So effectively what we need is we need to find solutions to remove more greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So we're looking for something that's in the light orange to do that. Now there aren't numbers on this graph, but if you look at numbers, you realize that that is a huge lift. We have to remove a lot. We've put a lot of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. We have a lot of work to do. So this is where the ocean comes in. We think one of the most promising ways of doing this is to exploit the vast surface area and, in fact, the sort of energy, the light hitting the ocean. This is one way you can scale to really big, where you can actually have a climate scale impact. There have been various approaches that have been proposed for this, and essentially what we're doing here is some intervention, some action in the ocean that will pull greenhouse gases into the ocean. In this case, we're talking about CO2, and store it securely and long-term in the ocean. You can kind of classify these techniques into two categories. They're engineered solutions, which is perhaps the most like what Aliki talked about with methane, or you can think of direct air capture as an analog here. You can also have direct seawater capture, which is that kind of cartoon on the left, where you pull CO2 directly out of the seawater and then store it somehow, maybe in an underground reservoir. What we're focusing on, what we think is the most promising, are what you call nature-based solutions. So here you're essentially using something, some process that nature is doing anyway, and enhancing it. And by enhancing it, we're increasing the uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere to the ocean. There are various things that have been proposed here. We're focusing on two of these, and these are stimulating microalgae, what we call phytoplankton, and cultivating seaweed. And Jago is going to talk next about the seaweed cultivation aspect. I'll touch on it briefly here. Just to say there's quite a big group involved in this work. These are some of the names. Apologies if I missed anyone out. One thing I really like about this is it's an extremely interdisciplinary field. And here in Cambridge, we're working closely. So I'm in the Applied Maths and Theoretical Physics department. We're working very closely with colleagues in earth sciences. Some of the names that are up there, including a group of wonderful PhD students and 3 terrific MPhil students. I see Joy is in the back of the room, Joy is working on kelp and thinking about mapping the potential for kelp worldwide. Unjin and Anthony are working on carbonate chemistry. Okay, so there are 2 projects, and I just want to give a quick overview of what we're doing here. So the first one we're calling marine biomass regeneration. And the idea here is to stimulate phytoplankton, microscopic algae, that are the ocean's primary producers. So these do the vast majority of the photosynthesis, the conversion from inorganic carbon to organic carbon in the ocean. And what happens naturally is the phytoplankton grow, and they get consumed by little critters called zooplankton, on up the food chain, eventually to fish. But some of that material sinks out. So some of the material sticks together, it forms marine snow. If you've ever been scuba diving or snorkeling in productive water, like around the UK, you'll have seen this. And that slowly floats down into the deep ocean. Some of it makes it all the way to the seafloor. But the timescales for the water to come back to the surface are quite long. And so once that material and the carbon that it carries goes down into the deep ocean, or in fact it's buried, it can take hundreds to thousands of years before that carbon comes back to the surface. So this is quite a long-term removal of carbon from the climate system. We're working as part of a consortium being led now by USC. There's a group in Goa, a group in the University of Hawaii, and a group at Cape Town. And we're all working together on this project. And one of the things we're doing is we're exploring a novel solution here, so a novel approach to add nutrients to the ocean to stimulate phytoplankton. So basically to increase that natural uptake of carbon by these microalgae. And the approach we're looking at is using what we call buoyant flakes. They're just rice husks that are residue, sort of leftover from farming, and coating them with nutrients that the phytoplankton need. And the advantage of that is they stay floating in the water, as you can see in this experiment up there. They slowly release the nutrients to the water, and that can stimulate the growth of the algae. So we're approaching this using lab experiments. Those are mostly done at the University of Southern California. Experiments, actually, these are kind of like field experiments. So these tanks that we call mesocosms, they're big, essentially big, deep bags that mimic what's happening in the natural ocean, but in a controlled environment where we can study this very closely. And finally, the group here is using numerical simulations to try to link these together and also expand out to global scales to say what would happen, given what we learn in the lab and the mesocosms, what's going to happen globally. The second area that we're doing, second sort of strand of work we're doing in this area is with seaweed, and in particular kelp, which is a type of what we call brown macroalgae. There are different types of macroalgae. These are now large algae, as the name implies. And kelp is one. So what we're looking at here on the left is a kelp farm. This is a farm by a company, I think it's based in Norway, called Ocean Rainforest. This farm is actually in California, and they're growing giant kelp, which is native to that area. They're growing giant kelp attached to these lines as a possible way of removing carbon from the ocean, in a very similar way that the microalgae would. And this is work that Jenna, who's a PhD student working with myself, Sasha Turchin, who's in Earth Sciences, and Kristen Davis from Stanford. Jenna actually talked about this work in the autumn in the seminar series here. She was at this, on this field trip expedition in the summer going to that kelp farm. They collected a bunch of measurements, and now Jenna is analyzing that data to try to understand how the kelp are growing and where the carbon goes. And the second thing we're doing, and this will lead to Jago's work, is studying what happens in a natural kelp forest. So an advantage here is there are natural kelp forests. This is one off the coast of Santa Barbara that Jago's been studying that are relatively large. And this one in particular happens to be very well instrumented. There's a long-term instrument record, record of where scientists from the University of California, Santa Barbara have been making measurements at that kelp forest. And the idea here is if we can learn what that kelp forest is doing, we can maybe apply that to understand what would happen if you had a kelp farm on a similar scale. And one of the challenges here is that the kelp farms early on, like the one on the left, are quite small scale, and it's somewhat hard to extrapolate the results out. Jago has done amazing work also in developing numerical tools to allow us to scale this out and understand what's happening using computer simulations. And I'm going to turn over to Jago now to tell us more about that.
So yeah, I'm going to talk about the kelp forest now. So the thing about kelp forests is that we can obviously see that they've grown a lot. We could go out and measure how big they are. So we know that there's lots of carbon going in, and they grow really fast, like up to 30 centimeters a day. So we know there's lots of carbon going into the system, but we don't really know where it goes after that. And so if we want to just understand natural kelp forests, or if we want to grow more kelp forests, we just don't know how much carbon that's actually storing. Because in this diagram, we've got the kelp forest on the right, and then it releases DOC and POC, so dissolved and particulate organic carbon, because they squeeze out carbohydrates and then bits break off. And because kelp grow on hard surfaces, it can't get buried there like in seagrass meadows, the carbon gets buried in the soil there. So the carbon dissolved in particulate is transported away from the forest, but then it gets broken back down into carbon dioxide as it moves away. And it's really unclear where that ends up, because if it just stays at the surface, gets broken back down, it'll end up back in the atmosphere, but then some fraction, but we just don't know what, ends up in the deep ocean, like John was talking about the phytoplankton. So we're trying to understand like what's going on with all the carbon coming in and out of the forest. So the first step we did for this was to develop a model of to implement this existing model of how the kelp move. So basically they're just like blobs which drag on the water and attach together with elastic strings. And then we coupled this with the fluid to see how the stuff gets transported in and out of the forest. And as John said, there's lots of data about this forest. And from that, we could constrain some of the parameters in the model. And we then have just a simple tidal flow going backwards and forwards, and you can see all the kelp in the forest moving backwards and forwards. And so the first step we took was to understand how water gets in and out of the forest. So that's like the nutrients getting in or the different types of carbon getting out. And to study this first, we had the forest release a tracer in like this simple way. So the color you can think of as like the inverse of, it's like how the nutrient being depleted. So if it's black, there's no nutrient left in the water, or that's where like dissolved organic carbon in the water is highly concentrated. So you can see most of it actually stays quite close to the forest, but some fraction is exchanged with the far field. And we found that there's actually a concentration, like a density of the forest. This doesn't work. In the left plot, you can see there's so we changed the amount of kelp that were in the forest, and you can see there's a density at which it maximizes the exchange. of the tracer with the outside, which just it happens to correspond with the density of real life forests, so that could suggest that that's what limits the growth of the forests, which is relevant for if we want to grow more forests, like how dense can we plant them. So to explain this, we found that we derived a timescale for how quickly the water gets exchanged into the forest, and then the release timescale from that tracer release equation, and we find that that's where they intersect at that density. So basically the exchange with the outside water is limited by how quickly new water, like fresh water, can get into the forest before it becomes saturated. So we're maximizing the saturation, but exchanging it. Because if you have more kelp, then it saturates the water faster, but it doesn't get exchanged with new water quick enough to replenish it. So the next step that I have been working on is adding more realistic physics, because the shallow coastal environment is quite a physically complex environment, because especially in the summer when most of the growth is actually happening, the surface water gets a lot hotter, so it becomes stratified, which means that the surface water doesn't mix with the deeper water. So if we took like a random place away from the kelp forest, we'd expect there to be phytoplankton growing at the top, because that's where all the light is, but then they'll deplete the nutrients, and the deep water will have more nutrients in it. So in kelp forests, we know that the deeper blades take up the nutrients and the surface blades take up the light more. So I've been putting all the different pieces, like the wind stress and the light and the surface heat exchange, together to just like be able to replicate the physics of like the background environment, and then we can this is not finished work, so this isn't quite correct, but if we then put the kelp back in, and in between the lines on the top is where the forest is, and the color is the temperature, and you can see that as the flow comes through the forest, so like on the outsides, on the far sides, we have a strong stratification where it's warm at the top, but then as it comes through the forest causes it to mix down, which would bring more nutrients to the surface, and that could enhance. That's probably important, firstly for the kelp's growth, because it mixes through the nutrients through the whole forest, but also it could enhance the phytoplankton growth around the forest, because because the surface water is getting more nutrients to it. And so now we've got these two pieces. We've got the kelp flow, like the effect of the kelp on the flow and the physical background, and then we wanted to add, now we need to add in like the growth of the kelp, so that we can work out what types of carbon are coming out of the kelp forest. And so a big part of my work has been developing Ocean Biome, which is a Julia library that facilitates modeling what we call the biogeochemistry, so the nutrients and the phytoplankton and all of the like microscopic biology in the ocean. So we've got all these components that are typically quite hard to put together, and we've made this package to hopefully make that easier. And then we've also added, so like the main unique thing about Ocean Biome is that we can have these, what we're calling active particles, where in this case, it's kelp that can grow on their own and release and interact with the biology and the chemistry in the water to take up nutrients or release these different types of carbon. So we've got like two pieces of this biological side. We need to be able to replicate what's going on in the background biology, but then also to model how the kelp grows. So one of the things I've been doing is developing this model of how kelp grows, where we basically have, as I said before, like these active particles, and then each one can take up nitrogen from the water, and usually nitrate, take up carbon from photosynthesis, and then each particle has lots of blades. So a typical kelp has like about 100 blades. We might not model them all explicitly, but like that's what we're replicating. And then these blades grow, and we track the area of them, and they get broken down, which releases the particulate carbon, or if there's too much photosynthesis, it can release these carbohydrates into the water. And that also depends on the age of the plant. And there's all these parts that I've been trying to put into this model, and we've, so far with the model, all I've done is run it offline, so like using nutrients from global models, and just so you can just imagine one kelp on its own in the middle of the ocean or in like a controlled tank or something, and we get this seasonal growth where, so if you start with the bottom plot, the orange line is the carbon in the plants, and you can see that the carbon starts going up early because there's light, so the kelp starts taking in carbon from photosynthesis, and then later on the plant starts to get bigger as there's nutrients available, but then the light goes down and then it starts dying off again. So we now have these separate parts. We've got like the kelp growth, the kelp physics, and what I'm currently working on is putting them all together. So we have like a seasonal cycle of the kelp growth, and from that we can infer where the carbon's going. It's like how much carbon's coming out as dissolved carbon, or how much particles are coming off as the kelp breaks down. And we can use that, and then we couple this with because this like very high resolution physics, where the kelp's interacting with the water, we can't run that for a whole year. So we're going to have we're going to run that for short periods in maybe the summer and the autumn, and that will inform how fast the nutrients gets into the forest. And then in the other way around, the kelp model informs what happens to the carbon. And so basically the next step for me is to do these experiments, and then hopefully from that we can understand, or like finish putting it together, do the experiments, and then from that hopefully we can infer where the carbon goes and how the kelp affects the other biology. So yeah, kelp is important because it definitely takes up a lot of carbon, but we don't know where it goes. And I've built all these different parts, and we're going to try and put them together to understand where the carbon goes and how it affects the carbon cycle. Thank you for listening.
Great. Do we have a microphone for the audience or not? We do. Perfect. Right. Questions. Remember, we've got Aliki, John, and Diego. So any questions from the audience? Okay, we'll take a question from the lady in the middle here first, please. Thank you.
Obviously, to try and have an impact on the amount of carbon in the environment, you'd need to rapidly increase the amount of kelp and phytoplankton that we have. Do you have an idea of how, say, increasing this would affect the sunlight that gets to the ecosystems lower down, or the marine life that lives there, and what impact that would have on sort of the wider ecosystems within the ocean?
Yeah, so that's part of what we want to find out is, so like, because the kelp, would shade the lower down, or in the other one where you stimulate the phytoplankton growing, that would shade lower down. But so that's why we need to have these models of the whole system, because then if we do it without the experiment, without the intervention, and then we can compare what the net effect is.
Great. Next. I'll take the next. We'll just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
My name is Z. I'm from National University of Singapore, and I was studying TU Delft, and now I start my research at MIT. I'm waiting here. Very appreciate. So my question is about, because I focus on philosophy of technology. So nowadays with AI, it's very centralization of the technology, with also very centralization with capital and with power. Looks like the climate repair also very high technique, centralizing also with investment also centralizing somehow. So I just wondering if they're well kind of like decentralizing maybe from these areas with new technology. With also the investment could be make it more benefit with the developing country, or with like a diversity of the global context. Thank you.
In the context of kelp, do you want to answer that, John, in terms of just the co-benefits for local economies, or would you like me to? Be better coming from you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I do think one of the advantages that kelp, this sort of method, have over say stimulating phytoplankton and microalgae is that there are many economic benefits of kelp. So you can use seaweed for for food, possibly for biofuels. So there's a sort of actually integrate it with the local economy and have local benefits. One of the things that we've been working with a group called the Kelp Forest Foundation, who are in turn working with a group in Namibia that are growing kelp in the local waters there, and developing an industry. Yeah, this is in Lüderitz, Namibia. Kelp Blue is the name of the group trying to do this, and so they're actually focused on the economics. So they're focused on they're trying to harvest the kelp to make a fertilizer, and that's their product, their economic product. But there's some evidence that there will be a co-benefit, which is the climate, because not everything, you don't harvest everything. Pieces of the kelp break off, and as Jago said, some of it gets dissolved back in the water. So there could be some carbon removal as a side effect, if you like, or a positive benefit from the economic activity.
I mean, there's a similar argument with Aliki's work on methane, which is there are potential health benefits. So if you apply a catalyst in a ventilation system, and actually that Aliki mentioned NOx, SOx, and actually if you get it right, it may even knock out VOCs, volatile organic compounds, and therefore, that's unclear by the way. It could make things worse if you don't do it correctly, but if you can show that it actually provides a benefit. Actually, the material here and now is about health benefits today, and the fact that it's knocking out methane is then a co-benefit. But just thinking through the wider context, about sort of what are appropriate technologies, and in part it's driven because our carbon markets and things like this are pretty underdeveloped in a way in terms of the scale that they need to be globally. So, reframing it, can you think of other things that we might be able to explore? And if there are other benefits and the climate is the co-beneficiary, then that's possibly worth considering, certainly in the near term. Andrew.
Hi, yeah, I've got a question on the methane and a question on the kelp. So on the methane, I want to understand what the cost difference of these different solutions are, because having a larger surface area versus a more effective catalyst might be quite a sensible trade-off. And on the kelp, it seems like the stratification is potentially quite a big barrier that could be overcome relatively simply by some engineering, like introducing sort of periscope-like structures that force the water to change depth, so you get like vertical mixing. I just wondered if that seems like it would be a promising opportunity.
Aliki, do you want to answer the question on the...
Yeah, that's for lower concentrations that we saw that just the substrate, the titanium dioxide, works very well. It is a cheap material, so it can be used for larger surface areas. For the cases where we have to account for metal particles, like for higher concentrations, which is not something that we focus on, of course it will be more expensive. But the key thing here is that titanium dioxide is a cheap material and can be used for larger surface areas.
Yeah, so like in the kelp forests probably naturally almost fully overturn the water anyway. But I guess without the kelp, it's like that's similar to like the artificial upwelling idea that you bring up this nutrient-rich water, and it's something people are considering, but I think it's something that people are exploring. Yeah, that's a much bigger depth. Yeah, I think in the kelp forest it is fine on it. Like the kelp does probably cause the overturning anyway. But away from the kelp forest, I don't know, in coastal waters if it would stimulate more carbon.
Jason.
Yeah, I've got a question for John. I'm not a scientist, so excuse me if this is a really ignorant question, but you're adding nutrients to the seawater to encourage the growth of phytoplankton. As I understand it, like a lot of water has a kind of nutrient problem, like lakes and rivers kind of being getting an excess of nutrients from agricultural runoff, and I guess a lot of that goes into the oceans. So I'm just wondering what the relationship between these kinds of nutrients is.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. It's it's a really good point. So there is in some coastal waters, when you're near rivers, we did some work in the Gulf of Mexico where there's a lot of nutrients input from the Mississippi River. You can have harmful algal blooms that impact fisheries and other coastal uses. So actually, there's a link with the kelp here because kelp are very nutrient hungry. They need a lot of nutrients, and so it's been proposed to use kelp in places like that, where you can soak up the nutrients with the kelp and enhance photosynthesis. But if you look kind of globally in terms of the ocean area, the vast majority of that is nutrient limited. So actually, there's not enough nutrients for the phytoplankton to grow, and if you add more nutrients, you'll get more growth of the phytoplankton.
More questions? Yes. No, just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
I've got two questions for the first speaker. It might sound a bit simple, but I just want to know the answer. The first one is, what does ppm stand for? You use that a lot with a unit.
It is parts per million, so it is related to the concentration.
Okay. And then the second question is, because I'm aware that you said there's 39% of methane made from naturally, then how is methane made artificially generated by us?
From oil and gas industry, basically.
Oh, yeah.
This is comes from human activities, while the most of it has 40% comes from wetlands, and then 20% from agriculture. So yeah, waste.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any others? We'll take Zach first, and then
Thank you. There's a bunch of different greenhouse gas removal technologies, and I'm just wondering, from the perspective of a strategy for funding the research or for implementation, I guess you could implement a bunch of different ones and they don't conflict with each other because they're all just removing stuff from the atmosphere. So is the best approach just at the moment to look into all these different solutions, or are there some that are sort of clearly a lot more promising than others, so we should just focus everything in that direction?
So it's a good question, and there are other greenhouse gas removal approaches that we have not discussed today that are being researched here at the University of Cambridge and with partner organisations as well. And as John alluded to, well, described in the response to Jason's question, they have different characteristics too in terms of there are benefits. There are some potential questions that we've got as well regarding what are the potential harms for certain interventions, and therefore the reason why they are all research projects is we don't have the answers to those questions fully at the moment. So the strategy for which kind of approaches that we are seeking funding for have, and in large part, have been reasonably successful in securing funding for, is that we are picking ones which we think have global potential of order, circa 1 gigaton, 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year in terms of sequestration. Number two, are relatively underserved in terms of research. Number three, where actually we think that there's a roadmap which could mean that they could make a meaningful difference within about a period of about 10 years. Because if it's going to be 100 years' time before they would ever see the light of day, then frankly, we'd rather focus on those which could have a nearer term impact. So broadly speaking, that's the way that the strategy's been developed. And do we claim that we've got it all right? No. And in fact, only very recently have we started sort of supporting direct air capture. So 4 years ago, I wasn't convinced that it was a really, really scalable solution because of the energy needs and things like that. Actually, it's time for another presentation. But the reason why we've arrived at that is that there are some things that are very different about the approach being developed by a gentleman called Dr. Alex Force and Stuart Scott here at the engineering department that mean that actually it could sort of fit a national or international strategy. We'll take a question at the back from Andrew.
Thank you very much for an excellent seminar series. I just have a question about sort of a back of the envelope calculation, or perhaps even on a napkin. How big a removal could you get from a ventilation system using the catalytic conversion of methane, say in a building as big as, here we are, engineering?
That's a very good question. I wish I knew the answer to that specific question. But the reason why we picked methane and then we originally got excited about ventilation was that if you scaled up the amount of air being moved in buildings by mechanical ventilation systems worldwide, we got to something, certainly hundreds of megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, with methane potency considered on shorter timescales rather than 100-year timescales. I think it's surprising, but that's why we are continuing to pursue that particular project. And there is a publication being worked on right now, be submitted fairly soon, with Leakey, and Samuel Tomlinson is the first author on that.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. Well, it's just a few minutes before 2 o'clock. Is this room being used at 2? Okay, but you may have lectures to go to, some of you anyway. Assuming you want to go to lectures, that is, undergraduates. But I want to thank our speakers today. So Eliki, John and Diego, thank you so much indeed for actually a very enriching seminar on greenhouse gas removal. What I would encourage you to consider is that I think, Natalie, remind me, 21st of March. Please, if you've got a phone, take that QR code, but there's an evening seminar as part of the Cambridge Festival on Friday, the 21st of March in the Babbage Lecture Theatre. Various exciting speakers. Oliver Morton, one of the editors with The Economist, is going to be sharing his thoughts with us that evening, and I would encourage you to sort of have more stimulation with another selection of great speakers. But in the meantime, many thanks indeed for our speakers today.